Okay, we're going to talk about DAZ Studio today, which is a character creation software, and you can use it to create 3D characters, maybe something like this if you're into RPGs without the asinine shorts. So the software itself, there are other tools like MetaHuman and stuff that Unreal's coming out with now, which are probably better, but they do kind of have AI black boxes. This at least gives you full control over the process. DAZ Studio itself is kind of an aging, resting on its laurels software, but there's an awful lot of content that's been developed in here by all the artists, so that gives you a valuable resource if you want to do that type of character in your game. So first, I'm going to say I'm on this version of Linux that I just installed recently here, Cinnamon Mint 21.3. Hopefully it'll work on other distributions too, but with all of the different ones, obviously I can't guarantee that. So I want to show this running first of all. Okay, so here, the point of showing this is that iRay works. I didn't have to do anything special to get it to work. I did read about some people needing to do so. I'm going to link a thread on their forums in case it's of use to anybody. But I'm just going to go through the process that I went through to get to this point. There are a few things that were weird just to make note of. One is the scroll, the mouse wheel here. It's backwards, like it's inverted, which is a little strange. Oddly, not enough to bother me. And also, when you add something like this, I'll put this stupid looking hair that it comes with to induce you to buy other hair. So yeah, whenever you do something, like when you add something to the scene, it seems like it does that resizing, probably some game full screen behavior, I don't know. Annoying, but very easy to get by. So I'm going to close this now. Okay, so this is Lutris, and this is where it's running from. Now on Mint, I just go into the software manager and I get this flat hub, this flat pack here, and I installed that. That's what's running here. All right, so we're going to install it now. We're just going to do the same process I did here for demoing it. We're going to install from a game executable. We're going to install the DAZ install manager, which is what it's their manager for installing assets, including DAZ Studio itself. So DAZ installer, whatever. Setup file. We're going to pick the file. Unintuitively, it makes you pick the path that you're installing to before the actual setup file. So what this is, I'm going to show the one I already have here under this DAZ folder. That's actually your wine environment. So here, the drive C within the wine environment, which is, like I said, that's what you're picking the path for here, which is not obvious. When you're running the application in Windows, it's going to see this drive C folder as the C hard drive. So that's how that's going to work. So I'm just going to create a second one. I'm calling it DAZ instead of DAZ installer because eventually we're going to install DAZ Studio itself from the installer, and it'll be in that same wine environment where we want it. So DAZ installer is not really accurate because we're going to put more in there. Now we select the file. So in my case here, I've got the install file. Click install. It's going to create the wine environment now, so this appears on the other screen here. It's just setting that up. And here's the install, typical install, just agree to everything. It'll have a couple other items come up here, just the Microsoft dependencies, like so. Okay, here we go. So when it finishes, don't launch it, because if you get into installing stuff and everything, this doesn't close, and then Lutris doesn't see that it finished installing, and then it won't give you the shortcut here. So DAZ installer, that's the new one. Now we're going to go back in there. I'll double click it. So I'm just filling this in off screen. You have to fill in your account info. Typical, like you don't have to pay just for having it, but of course they want to make sure you don't miss out on any of their special offers. So here's the install. So when you first start it up, it's going to, darn it. Ahem. So when you first start it up, it's going to ask you to install this, which are basically dependencies in the basic content. Cancel that first. So we want to go up to settings here first, and in basic settings, this is where the paths that it installs to. So again, all this is relative to that C drive. So now that I've got this DAZ2 folder, all of that's relative to here. So think this folder here when you think C drive here. So what it does, and I don't know if this is a wonkiness from Lutris or whatever, but you can see here it puts the database space in your user directory and then the rest in this public user directory. I don't think that should matter, but in order to avoid any ambiguity, especially with case sensitive paths in Linux, I like to just set this to a single folder where it's going to populate from. You'll see what I mean here. So I'm just going to pick the C drive because it's got enough subdirectories as it is. And see here, all of them are, now a little more organized, where, you can intuitively find them, and hopefully so can the application. So now that that's done, we can go ahead and start this install queue. Okay, now it brings you to this dumb web page. Ignore that. So right here, now it's installed. So now we can close the install manager. So in here, we can see here's applications where we pointed that folder, so we'll come back to that. So now we still have this launcher here, which is to launch the installer, but we want to be able to launch DAZ Studio. But we want it to be in that same wine environment, in this same drive C. So what we just need to do is duplicate this launcher. Just call it DAZ Studio. I'm going to call it 2 because I already have a DAZ Studio, like so. And then just right-click and configure. And in, I believe it's game up. Yeah, here. So you'll see here, this is the executable path. So this is to launch the installer, but we're going to use the same wine environment, but now we want it to launch DAZ Studio itself. So here's the wine environment we picked, DAZ-2. And once again, here's where that drive C comes into play. And then we just need to navigate to that path that we set. So the actual applications in 64-bit, DAZ 3D, Studio 4, and DAZ Studio right here. So just click OK on that, save it. We'll double click that, and we should be opening DAZ Studio. Okay, so the splash screen's on my other monitor. Again, it does come up with this just so we can see that. A new potential content directory has been detected. Sure. So this is basically the default library it picks. So I'm just going to say, oh, would you like to add it? Sure. Okay, I don't need to participate in any of this nonsense. I don't need to work online. I'm just demoing this. Okay, so I'm going to go to the content library here, and here's where the default stuff. So this might be some cross-platform wonkiness. I don't know. We've got 2 copies here. Nothing's in these. I think this is just DAZ being stupid. So just to make this clear, I'm going to delete those. Remove the base directory that doesn't even exist for that. Okay, so now this is what like if you were to install stuff through, I think, the DAZ store or their install manager, it would by default go into this library of stuff, basically categorized, how they have it laid out here. So what we're going to take a look at is where that is, just so we are clear on that. So here again, here's the drive C, and that is still in applications, but in this data folder. That's where we drill down to where this is stored. And this My DAZ 3D library, that folder gets created by default. And you can see here, this is where all of those folders are. So now we're going to create another folder to be, your user library. And then we'll add it here to have it recognize that. So in here, I'm just going to create a new folder, My Library. So now we'll go here. Let's go up to the Studio Formats, right-click, and add a base directory. And now we just need to navigate to that folder that we just created. I'm going to go right to my computer. This is a little weird. This file browser has never improved. Data, DAZ 3D, and here's that folder we just created. So click that, and now that folder is registered as a library there. Again, I don't know why it starts with those like duplicates, but I just clear them out, and that way I make sure it's kosher. So now we come to a little bit of a difficulty with the uppercase and lowercase problem between Windows and Linux. So if you don't already know, Linux treats uppercase and lowercase letters differently, and Windows does not. So presumably if you're installing through the install manager or something like that, and it's going into DAZ's default library, hopefully that will at least be consistent and you won't have to worry about that. But let's say you want to install something manually. So as an example, I picked up this thing. It's like, okay, cool. That looks kind of cool. I want to try it out. So that's off Renderosity, just one of many sites. And you might end up having to install manually. So I'm going to bring a file over here. So this is the zip file I get from that. And in here, you can see same folder structure as here, right? Except it's, it's not a list, but you get the idea, right? So like there's the data folder, documentation environments, whatever. So the way you can manually install an asset like that is, and I'm going to do this in my library, it's going to separate the stuff I'm installing manually, basically. Do like so, and then just pull all of those files in. And then if we go back to DAZ Studio and we refresh this, we now see, I hope, yeah, Yeah, so there's the loft. So that's what we want to see. Now, there comes a problem with doing this though. So when, depending on who created the art or whatever it is, they may choose to do different things as far as the paths. One I've seen most is in runtime textures. Like, so you'll see a folder like this, right? So it'll be DAZ 3D and DAZ 3D. So this is an example of where Microsoft treats these the same. So if different artists create folders like this, it doesn't matter in Windows, but it does matter in Linux. So I built a tool to handle this situation because anytime you install a new asset like this, you could run into this. So I will obviously link that. This is the tool itself. Just go over to the release and you'll have a built version of it for Linux. Or if you want it, I use PyQt6. So if you want to install the library and run vanilla Python, it's a Python tool. So I'm going to start that up. Here's what it looks like. So to explain what this does. So first off, before you run this thing, I think it's a good idea to just back up your user library, especially if you have a lot of stuff in it. So if you check this, when you run this fixed directories down here, it's actually going to put a backup zip file of your entire, user library that you put here in whatever path you put up here. A word of warning about that, I need to figure out how to do that asynchronously or whatever, because right now it takes a long time and it'll be like, do you want to wait? The program's not responding. So because if you have like gigabytes in there, that's going to take a while. So I would recommend doing it manually, just whichever you want though. So right here we have the DAZ main library path. So what that's for is if we go back here, again, the default library that DAZ installs, what that's going to do is act as a control, so to speak. So if there is a discrepancy between, paths that are identical between the user library that you pick, which in this case will be this folder, and the main library, it will rename it to the main libraries, like upper or lowercase, whatever that is. But that's actually just cream on top. More importantly is that you don't have stuff like this going on in your user library. So I'm just going to put a folder in here, maybe create a file just so we can demonstrate this, that it's combining those contents. So what you need to do is just put in that whole path to your main library and that whole path to your user library. This save paths the file. So once you get that set up, because you're not going to want to repeat that 50 times, if you click save, it will save those paths to a file. And that just goes into a little pickle file, it's called. I'm going to put mine in here. So just to show that. So when you start the application up, once you say that if that file exists, it will populate them. So now it's got my actual paths in there. And here we see the duplicates, so I'm going to, now that those are good, I'm going to hit Fix Directories. And nothing's going to happen because this is my original environment, not the DAZ 2 environment where I created the fake folders. Just kidding, so try this again. Okay, so in here it's going to log what it's, if it runs into anything, basically, you'll see something here. So now we can see, hey, found that. You look in here, now it's got both those. So that's the main thing you want to avoid. And then once it's solved that problem, at the end, if this exact path all the way down the hierarchy exists in that main library, it'll rename it to that as well for consistency. So in the case that there is not the same exact folder in this library, which will happen often, it's not going to have the same folder for every asset you have. It's just going to pick the folder with the most objects in it. Because at least in that case, then you are leaning towards whichever is more commonly being used by the artist. So the next item is Diffeomorphic. Now, if you're not familiar with Diffeomorphic, it's much better than the software DAZ makes. Like they have a DAZ to Blender bridge and a DAZ to Unreal bridge. Both of them are kind of trash, but this is an amazing tool that this guy works on all the time. And we're going to use that to, if you want to get stuff out of DAZ and into Blender. So again, this is mostly about getting stuff working in Linux. So I'm not going to go super deep into installing Diffeomorphic, but the basics, it's got some scripts where you install them into the DAZ library. This is a common folder. You'll see it in the main one as well. We're just going to have a scripts folder. And if you get Diffeomorphic, it comes in the form of, like, it's broken up into several modules. Import DAZ is the main one. So that comes as a zip file. But within that zip file, like most of that, you can just install as a Blender add-on. But within there, we have this 2 DAZ Studio folder, which has the scripts. So we want those to be in here. And we'll see this right here. We refresh, scripts, diffeomorphic. So there we go. So if you go in here and you go double click setup menus, it does its thing. Menu entries created. Thanks for minimizing that or shrinking that. And then here you'll see export HD to Blender and export to Blender. So those, what they do is wherever you've saved your scene file in DAZ, wherever that is in the same folder, it creates this DBZ file, I believe it is, and that's what you'll import into Blender. That's what allows the add-on to pull into Blender. So let's go back to that environment I grabbed. So the more common use for DAZ obviously is characters, but hey, I've got this, so I'm going to use this as an example. So we're going to export this thing. I'm going to fit file. First, I'm going to save the scene. Actually, I need to do that first. Save it as loft. Great. And then now that it's saved as a scene, we're going to export to Blender. And it's just picking the same thing here, save. And after some seconds, depending on the size, it'll come up and tell you it's done. So now we're going to go over to Blender. Blender, thankfully, has a Linux installation, so we don't need to do that. So you see here, I've already got Diffeomorphic installed. If you just do the import DAZ module, you'll get these two, like DAZ setup and DAZ runtime over here. Just to quickly show that, to install it, you would go to add-ons here, click install, and where have I got it? In here. So in my case, there's a zip. I'd install it, but that's already done. That's over here. So now, when you get in here, you've got this global options. So if you look at Diffeomorphic's webpage, they have instructions on how to save the paths. So if we go back over here, and your scripts are going to be like save paths. The problem is we're running this inside of Wine. So this is where that comes into play. That C drive that it's looking for, in reality, is just this folder. So that save root paths is not going to cut it. We need to give it the actual path according to Linux, and Blender can see that. So here, the important ones up here you see are these content directories. So you're going to grab, again, to those same libraries we used in that Python tool to fix them. Those are the paths it's going to look for here. So that way Diffeomorphic can find your assets. So if we look here, for example, it would be this folder. And here, I would just copy the full path here and then put that in here. In fact, let's do that because in order to demonstrate the loft that I just did, we'll need to do that. So we're also going to go up and grab this library. Like so. Paste that in there. So again, it's only the DAZ 2 is the only difference. And you can add more content directories if you have more libraries. That's what this is for here. And these are output paths, so not such a big deal. So I'm going to click OK. All right, one thing I forgot to mention is you do have to be careful. So when we saved this as a scene, it did not go into those library paths that we know and love. So if you actually follow this, thank God it has a drill up button. Where I saved the scene, we'll hit up, My Library, Studio, DAZ 3D, Documents, blah, 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 blah. So you see what it did is it actually put it in, as if it's in your Windows user folder. So if you go through this, Documents, backwards here, it has the I think that's probably why we had those duplicate folders in the beginning. So despite the fact that I set the base paths before actually installing the software, it did put the library content in those folders that we set up, but it also created its libraries in its original default location, and that's where it saved that loft scene. Like I said, it's resting on its laurels software. Anyway, so you can obviously, when you're clicking save as, you can just change that to the proper directory, which I did not do, but it's good illustration. So now going back to Blender, keeping that in mind, we're going to go to easy import or whatever. I'm just going to go change this to one of these settings that are meant for environments, which it indicates here. And now I just got to find that folder. So DAZ 2, here's the environment. This is the C drive. Go into the redundant user, crud, documents, DAZ 3D, blah, 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 blah. Found it. There we go. So it won't matter which one you pick because it'll handle that much. Just click import. And I'm glad something else happened. I forgot to do that. So one thing you need to do, actually this is critical, I should have mentioned this. When you, utilities is where this is, the first time you run Diffeomorphic, you need to scan absolute paths right here. And furthermore, that tool I was showing earlier, anytime that you do this and you correct any paths, you need to do that again over here, because Diffeomorphic is actually what's going to get most confused by that mess. So we're going to click scan absolute paths anytime you run that tool, if you're using Diffeomorphic. All right, let's try that again. At least Blender remembers the path. And here we go. Let's see what that looks like rendered. Cool sauce. See if it's got any lighting in here. So there we go. So yeah, I mean, some people do like to work in DAZ Studio and do animating and rendering in DAZ Studio. More power to them. But if you're at a point where you can make the choice, I would advise getting the assets out of DAZ Studio as fast as humanly possible. And here we can, run screaming in the opposite direction of Windows, which is even better.